Hello, myth lover. I'm Maria. Welcome to the Women and Mythology podcast.
You are always being called by what we'll call the inner life, always. There is always something percolating, always something that wants your attention. And it's worth it. It's worth it to pay attention to those things, the things that rise up and catch your attention, and to see where they take you. It's so easy to imagine that we don't have time or that they're a tangent or that it's not going to go anywhere. But oftentimes the solutions or the medicine that we need, that's where it is. That's where it is. It's in that conversation. And that's what our myths tell us.
Mythmaker Podcast Network.
Hello, myth lover. Welcome back. Myth has long been my compass, a way to explore life's threshold, navigate change, and return to the self. In this episode, we step into the living field of myth, exploring what it means to cultivate a mythic sensibility and how that way of seeing can transform our relationships, our creativity, and our daily lives. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Catherine Svehla, mythologist, storyteller, and host of the Myth Matters podcast, as well as the creative force behind Mythic Mojo. Catherine earned her Ph.D. in Mythological Studies with an emphasis in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Through her writing, art, and conversation, she explores the unseen forces that shape our lives, guided by a deep devotion to imagination, integrity, and symbolic awareness. In our conversation, we explore what mythic sensibility looks like in every day, Psyche and Eros as a map of awakening between love and soul, helpers, surrenders, and right timing in Psyche's tasks, curiosity as a sacred and risky virtue for women, Aphrodite as initiator, jealousy, testing, and refinement, and creativity as a companion in seasons of transition. This episode is full of grounded wisdom and mythic insight, with rich reflections on the Greek tale of Psyche and what it still teaches us about the soul's unfolding. Let's dive in. Hi, Catherine. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor. And your work invites us to live with a deeper awareness, mythic consciousness that reconnects us to meaning, to place, to soul. For those who are new to this way of being, how would you describe what it means to live with mythic sensibility?
Mythic sensibility. Okay, we're jumping into the deep end right away. I like that. So to me, that means living with the understanding that psychic reality is real, that Psyche is real, that we're in it. When I think about how people respond to stories, and maybe this is the easiest way to elaborate on that. Some people think that they're entertainment, or especially old stories, they're history, and that's it. Fine, great. They're just at what we call the literal level. And then some people step into a story and they understand that it's a symbolic language and that it's metaphor and find meaning in it then, and maybe place themselves in the story and learn something about themselves. But once you get to that metaphor level, then you can make yet another step, which is to realize that a metaphor points towards something real. So that's when you start thinking, okay, we've got this goddess here, and I can look her up online and I can see all of these different stories that she's in and all these meanings that have been attributed to her. And I can even think about my own relationship to that. And this is a reference to an actual presence. It may not have the same reality as the chair sitting in my office does, but the psychic field is real too. And the conversation that we're in and the things that happen they tell us about more than what's going on in us. They tell us about what we're in. And to me, that's when you make the move. You've made the move to a mythic sensibility. And if you don't find it just a little bit unnerving, then you maybe haven't quite done it yet, in my experience.
It's such a beautiful and great lens. Are there any practices that you would recommend for a woman who wants to cultivate mythic sensibility within her?
I think that almost anything that you do where you employ a symbolic language to talk to yourself, to interact, to explore your experience. And that can be working with stories. It can also be ritual practices, light a candle at every new moon. There are many different things that people have done. If you develop a habit of doing those kinds of things and you make a turn outside of yourself, so in other words, practice moving beyond the conditioned skepticism that we have to speak to something in the room with you, for example. That's how it's happened for me.
Yeah.
It's been a matter of living in those spaces and developing those practices, and over time, like starting to chip away at the part of me that's purely self-referential. Does this make sense?
It does, absolutely. It actually, there is one practice that I do a lot from my love of stories, my love of myth and folktales, is when I'm working with a certain figure or archetype or image that I'm still not sure, I try to invite it inside the room. If it's a person, let's say like Baba Yaga, the witch, at the beginning when I started to explore her story, I actually invited her for tea, and I felt like she was sitting there on the couch or in a chair, always in the corner of the room. She was never so close to me, which is already information there to live. And it's so funny that even when I stopped doing the practice so actively, I would come into my living room and I would look at the couch where she would sit and I would think of her and I would live from that perspective.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Exactly. That reminds me of when I was in graduate school. I came across this comment that James Hillman made about ideas and entertaining ideas. And I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. Entertaining ideas, what would that mean? And so then I started experimenting when I had a paper to write or something and I didn't have a clue what I was going to do with this idea of experimenting. And I went as far as going, oh, okay, tea and making tea and setting out more than just my glass and like sitting and waiting. Like the idea is going to come and have tea with me. And that worked. Another thing that I think is helpful is interacting with other things in your environment in that as if. I mean, for some of us, it's obvious that our dogs, our cats, the birds, the squirrels, the rabbit that came out and hopped across the path when you were there are intentional, conscious beings. It's easier if you already know that. If you don't, then that's a thing you'll discover. But interacting with them too, understanding that you're in a world where you're constantly being addressed. You're being seen too. We're not just these sort of random, isolated, enclosed in our own skin, like beings walking around looking for connection. It's there all around us. And that's another one of the things that myth has helped me get more grounded in my own belief system, because the myths tell us that this is true. And as soon as you go, hey, what if it is? Then you start finding out, oh,
I love that. To approach the world as it's alive, an animate earth, isn't it? And there's also this idea that comes to me. I think it's Bill Plotkin. And he says, what if we approached the world and courted the world as if it was as intelligent as we are or more? The way that we would come into communion, connection would be very different. You mentioned the James Hillman idea came to you when you were in college. Can you tell us a little bit about your path? What drew you to myth? Was there a story, a turning point, a moment when myth became more than an academic pursuit and entered your lived experience, or perhaps the other way around?
Yeah, it was definitely the other way around for me. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I went through a real crisis and I started painting. It was a desire that welled up in me. And at the time, I was willing to let myself do anything that had any kind of spark behind it. And at a point, I realized, oh, I'm having a conversation with myself. And I'm processing things that are happening through these marks that I'm making. And I wouldn't really be able to explain to another person that, oh, that abstract painting over there is my mom. But I knew it. I could feel it. And so that got me really interested in the connection between art and story. And I also started reading Jung. This was mid 90s. Women Who Run with the Wolves came on to the scene in a big way. And I loved that book. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and a columnist for the LA Weekly, Michael Ventura, was publishing excerpts of a book that he was co-writing with James Hillman, 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse. And I really related to all of that. I continued studying art and this idea of a symbolic language for quite a few years. It's what led me to the notion of the archetypal, that there's something universal about all of this. So it was really the other way around. And then it's another story. It's a random moment in some ways, but where I listened to something inside that led me to Pacifica. And I was like, oh my God, I could get a degree in this.
Mm.
I think I will. So for me, it really started as a process of trying to find direction for myself and then taking the things that I was doing and the feelings they were generating in me seriously. And that's still one of the main pieces of advice that I would give anyone, is to take these things seriously. It's on my website. What rises up in you?
Thank you for sharing that. To take our purpose, our bliss, our meaning serious, it's so important especially for women, which in so many times we are dismissed or taught to dismiss ourselves. Shall we jump into a story? So in our communication, we were talking about Psyche and Eros, and I would love to ask you about the tale. I am someone who also loves the story. I know you do. And what is it about this story that continues to speak to you? Where do you find its relevance in today's world? And just for our listeners here, I'm going to assume that you know the myth, but if you don't, I'm going to have a link below for maybe the read up so we can just really focus on the commentary and all that richness.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good. I'm glad that you're providing that resource for people. Oh, wow. So, Psyche and Eros, soul and love.
Mm.
Here we have this ancient story, rolls back to, I think it was Apuleius who wrote it down from earlier Greek myths, as far as we know. So very old story about an awakening that takes place between love and soul. And I think it's a beautiful statement about our depth, the inner depth inside, and also about the psychic field that we're in. When I read that story, I have a sense of an unfolding process of becoming. And it reminds me that I am in a process, that there are these forces, mysteries is how I guess the term I usually use, that are inside and outside of me that can lead me to an awakening of my own mystery. And that's what I think the story is about. And it fascinates me because it is a mystery. So every time I go back to it, I notice things that I didn't notice the time before. And I feel that it's an important story for us today because so many of us are living in a culture that is reductive and that conditions us not only to not take those inner dynamics and those ideas seriously, but also tries to put us into kind of a machine commodity way of living and seeing ourselves. And so having this story that's about this mystery that's so poetic and also in its patterning offers us some practical steps or ways of interacting. I think it's one of the perfect stories.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I couldn't agree with you more. I feel it's definitely about this inner marriage, perhaps of love and soul, and so needed in our times. So you mentioned a little bit of the practical applications as well, like that the story offers us. And I feel it's very much related to Psyche's journey, right? That's filled with trials. She is asked to sort, to descend, to discern, to seek help, to persist. In your view, what do these tasks symbolize for us today, and especially as women navigating the pressures of modern inner and outer life?
I think, how would I answer that question? I see the story and the events of the story as a mirror, or each one of those moments as a mirror. So there's an opportunity there to look into it and see, what does this show me about myself or my life or how I'm operating? Which of these lessons do I need to learn right now? Or which of the helpers? Because that's another thing that I think is so interesting about this story and makes it, in particular, a piece of women's wisdom, that there are these helpers. Who do I need to call on?
And they're very feminine of the natural world. So they're very feminine helpers.
Yes, yes. And that they exist. I think that one of the things that I've learned as I have spent more time in story is that there's much more variety in our story inheritance than we tend to think. So it's easy to have the idea that the story is always about the male hero who goes out and slays the dragon or whatever. But there are thousands of stories that also involve some kind of awakening or meeting a challenge that don't follow that pattern, beginning with that it's a woman who's actually going through this process, but also stories like Psyche and Eros, where there's help, a lot of help along the way.
Do you see mostly this help coming from the outer world or more like our inner resources?
That's a good question. And that kind of depends. I do think inner resources, maybe, but also back to mythic sensibility, that there are helpers in the psychic field. Are the ants in the story? The ants, let's say, so we take that piece for just as an example. So one of her first tasks is that she's got to sort this gigantic mound of seeds into all of the different types of seeds. And it's going to be impossible for her to do. The ants come and help her. Okay, so depending on your situation, how you feel your way into the story, those ants might be an aspect of yourself that you need to call on. There may be some methodical, collaborative, organizing principle in yourself. It might be people around you. You might go, oh my God, why am I trying to do this myself? I know this person over here who this is exactly what she does. Why am I not asking her? Oh, okay, that's a conversation. She's my aunt. Or maybe maybe you call on the aunts. Maybe back to that new moon lighting a candle. Maybe you go, my God, I need aunts. Show me the ants. Where are my ants? Ants, please. And something appears. And you might experience that in your inner life, and you might experience that in the outer world. So it could be any of those things.
And probably a combination, especially for women, a combination of both. In the example of discernment there, trying to sort the seeds, I would see the ants very much as both my own ability, my own force, the organizational force there to sort, but then at the same time relying, and as you said, in the outer world, so with a therapist or just by being outside in the garden and really thinking things through and living them live inside of me and doing that process.
Yes, but I think it's very important, since you asked me about that mythic sensibility part at the beginning, to allow for these things to be more than something that we're going to call up in ourself as we know ourselves. And one of the things that I find really powerful about Psyche's story is that when she's given these tasks, for the most part, her first move is to realize that they're impossible for her, and she cries. And that surrender is so powerful. And it's not something that we're taught to do. It's interesting to me how many women I've told this story to, and I used to have a whole workshop around this story. And so much of the time, most of the time, women, they would be so annoyed with her. Why did she do that? So passive. She just fell down. She just collapsed. And it's like, there's something here for us all to work on, I think, as we take up the project individually of realizing ourselves, but of also looking at the patriarchy and the energies that we're in this culture and how we want to change these things. There's something really interesting there to think about. Is that a passive act?
No, there's so much wisdom in what you just said. And it's so true. I haven't seen from that lens, but it's now as you're saying, it makes so much sense because it is almost like that falling down and crying, that maybe act of even desperation, that feeling of desperation is the beginning of her descent. It's the beginning of understanding that it's going to be an unknown journey, that she has no way of how she's going to get out of that, if she's going to get out. And it's a necessary step for us in our journeys to be able to begin, right? And that release, that surrender is so important because a new self will emerge. And I wanted to ask you about this. One of the things I love about this story that is it moves us a little bit beyond the romantic ideals and into a soulful maturation, a gaining of our own identity from this descent, from this journey. Psyche moves from mortal to goddess. What does this myth teach us about love, not only in partnership, but also in relation to the self and the soul?
Another wonderful question. So what comes to mind for me, I'm going to mention the source because if you're not familiar with the poetry of Andrea Gibson, she just died recently at the age of 49. She was the poet laureate of Colorado. And I think her poetry, a lot of her poetry is really extraordinary. In one of the last messages that I received from her, not a personal message, I'm on her email list, she had this quote from Tony Hoagland, who said, "The truth is not the worst thing that can happen, although we often think it is." And to me, that speaks to the ways that we avoid really knowing the truth about ourselves, about the other that we're engaged with, and the nature of our relationship. The thing that I think about in terms of the evolution of the love in this story is that initially they were asleep. They met each other in the dark.
Mm.
And then she's motivated to bring light to the situation. She wants to see him. She wants to know the truth about him. And he leaves. And then she goes through her process and they're reunited. But it's that, what is really the path to intimacy? I think that a lot of us avoid really knowing the full truth of the other or of ourselves in those relationships, and so then miss out on the real intimacy. The other thing that I notice about this story when I look at it from that angle is how that quest for truth, and so therefore then for real intimacy, transmutes her suffering. It's not that those trials are suddenly easy, but they have a point. And she's motivated by love right through the whole thing.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful pull, the force of love keeping her there. I feel that love is for Eros, but it's also for the baby because she's pregnant. So there's a love for self as well. They're motivating her. And she is definitely, you can really see this in the story. She's leaving that maiden self more and more. That girl that is a little bit hopeless in the beginning, that she's just not sure what's going to happen. She's left right at the top of the mountain. Anything can happen to her. And she's taking agency over her life.
Yeah. Yep.
This story can also help people who are feeling lost, disconnected, depleted. And I know you speak about creativity in your work. And I was wondering if you can speak about this myth in this context as a source of inner guidance and a companion for women in times of transition.
I think I found this to be a particularly potent story. What I'm about to say, it could be brought to any story. I think if you read a story or you listen to a story, because now there's so many ways to do that online, and something in you resonates with it, to ask yourself, what if I'm in this story? What if I'm in this story? Then who am I in the story? What part of the story am I in? Those questions can put you very quickly into a relationship with the story and the pattern that's in it. And that in and of itself can be very powerful feeling of accompaniment, for one thing, because the story's already here. It's been here. Lots of people have used it. So when you're like, oh my goodness, here I am Psyche in this story. And this story has been around for thousands of years. Other people have been where I have been, or we wouldn't have this story. And now that I'm in here and I'm poking around in the part of it that I might occupy, I'm starting to have ideas about who the other players might be in my life, or what I might want to investigate next, or what could be happening, what the meaning of this could be. So I think that anytime I'm feeling lost, then I turn to stories. And at this point, I've been doing it long enough that often one will occur to me. Be like, oh, yes, let me sit and think about this one. What could this be? How could I be relating to this right now? But it's a matter of asking those questions and letting what comes up be significant. Is this answering your question?
It does. It reminds me so much of something that I'm going through right now. Is I'm a mother of 2 young children, and I love my work. It's actually really hard to navigate, to dance, to sacrifice a little bit on one side or sacrifice a little bit on the other side and be present for both in the way that I would like. And the task of collecting the golden fleece and that lesson about the right time, for me, it's been so important. So when it comes to creativity, when it comes to this threshold of motherhood and finding my new self, that lesson from the myth also has helped me so much of what's the right time to be with the children? What's the right time to come and do the creative work? How can it be done in a way that is not depleting? Doesn't mean that it doesn't going to have hard work and effort and sacrifices and compromises, but still, what's the right time to make it possible? So I really love the story and all that teaches us.
Yeah, it's interesting that you are turning to that point, because that part, I don't have the same mix of time constraints and balancing that you do, but that's the part of the story that has been most alive for me most recently too.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Would you
Yeah.
like to share a little bit why?
Yeah, I think that I have tended for a lot of my life to be someone who goes just straight at things and will muscle through. And the idea of right timing, but also that she goes and collects the fleece off the bushes.
Yes, that's true.
She doesn't go to the rams and like risk being trampled. So that what's required to wait and then go and just quietly pick it out of the bushes, rather than which still takes courage. They're asleep over there. We don't know how far away. But that's a different way of approaching some of the challenges that I am facing right now.
Thank you for illuminating that. It's not just the right timing. It's, I don't want to say minimal effort, because again, there is that life, death, life risk happening, but it's the right amount of effort as well. And it's a very feminine gathering. It is not a masculine, let me put a warrior armor and go face the rams, but it's just, let me gather here from the side when they are sleeping. So love that. And another thing about Psyche that I wanted to ask you, she is described as being too beautiful, right? That's even what ignites the whole thing with Aphrodite, which we need to get into her very soon. But this idea of being too much, she is too beautiful, almost unbearably. And I was wondering if you have any insights on how can we hold our own excesses and integrate the other aspects of ourselves that might be waiting to emerge. How can we integrate it in a way that is more wholesome, that is more friendly to ourselves as well?
I'll say that I think this is a process that takes place over time, because I think perspective, which one gains over time, accumulated, is part of it. In Psyche's case, her excess beauty, that to me is a signal of the archetypal energy that she's attached to. She's being initiated by Aphrodite. So the first thing I would say is that I think there is an archetypal context to these excesses. It reminds me a little bit of Hillman's book, The Soul's Code, where he talks about the way that a person's destiny or what it and forces they're engaged with show up in them. And it often happens very early in life, like it does with Psyche. She's a young woman, too beautiful, no one knows what to do with that or whatever. The purpose of that is revealed later on in her life. At the same time, we've got to live in all of this. And I think our excesses are often things that attract criticism from other people or that then we internalize. So I think another piece of that, of the process, is to identify and step back from those judgments with the idea of, so if this has a utility, if this is a multidimensional thing, what might it be?
Mm.
And it can often lead to other things. Just in brief, when I was a girl, this hasn't changed much, I was a big talker. And that was a joke in my family, but it was a joke with a little bit of judgment. because also I was a little girl, so supposed to be quiet. Over the years, though, see what that has become. What I have realized is that conversation is a central metaphor for me, and that's what I'm in all the time. I liken it to this, like excess thing. I think sometimes, I guess what I'm saying are, I think sometimes our excesses show us our the mythic context that we're in, the energy that we're tapped into, that is being expressed through us.
I think we need to add a disclaimer here that it's probably not all excesses, but many of them might be pointing to our gifts, to our potential, to something to follow rather than something to quiet, something to diminish. Still speaking of Psyche, she is led by curiosity, right? That beginning where she brings the light. You even said beautifully, she wants to know. And I was wondering, curiosity appears in so many myths, especially for women. It's a trait of the heroines, isn't it? And I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit about the power, the need for curiosity in a woman's life, both in myth and in our real physical world.
Curiosity, it's so important. It's often the first step or an evolution of what we might first experience as doubt or an intuition. When you allow it to, making the move to being curious, that gives you a little bit of distance. I think that oftentimes when we're dealing with situations or judgments that we have about ourselves, back to that truth thing, we know there's something there, but we don't really want to go there because we're afraid of what we're going to find out. And Psyche thought maybe her husband was a monster. I think you mentioned that she was pregnant earlier on. We could speculate that maybe she wouldn't have done it just for herself. But in any event, once you decide to be curious about something, then you're making the space to just accept or deal with whatever it is that you find out. And especially if that is a judgment about yourself, that brings some compassion with it. For women, I think we really need that because we're bombarded with judgments from all different angles. And, we know we're in a double bind most of the time. It's like anytime you do something and you allow for judgments and input from other people, some people are going to think you did the right thing. Some people are going to think you did the wrong thing. Some people are going to think you're like having some compassion for yourself and how you might not be perfect is a good way to invite curiosity. And alongside that, I think that the process involves allowing what we're curious about to be significant among all of the different priorities and all of the other things that people might want from us, to allow what we're curious about to be enough of a priority to pursue it. And then deciding to pursue it, getting comfortable with the fact that it might upset other people and giving ourselves permission to do it anyway. Eros didn't want her to light the light. She did it anyway. And so there's a certain amount of risk taking there. And I think that's part of why curiosity is such a potent word, because it does bring a certain amount of risk.
Thank you for sharing that. I see curiosity being such an important thread for women. And then, of course, we see it in the myths. I love what you said. It's related to our intuition. There is risk involved in following it, but it's very clear, the message that the myths show us it needs to follow for the journey to begin, for the growth to happen. We must follow our curiosity.
Yeah. And there are stories where it arises from things that from the outset seem more positive. If you like this story, then you might really like Valamon, the White Bear King. the white bear, and the dream, and a golden wreath. And then she agrees to go with the bear. Yeah. It's a variation on this Psyche and Eros story. But the differences are interesting.
There's a moment now going to the end of the tale where Psyche opens Persephone's box and she falls into a sleep, a deep, death-like sleep. What does that image invoke in you, and how do you read this moment symbolically? I honestly will share that's, for me, the most troublesome moment. I find it very difficult to read it symbolically in a way that sustains us, because maybe also Eros coming as savior troubles me. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, yes. I see that as a parallel to when Psyche lights the light and wakes him up. So early in the story, he's asleep and he wants to be asleep. And she brings a light and wakes him up. And his story primarily takes place off to the side. It's her story. It's about the process that as a human being we go through. And he's a god. He's a principle. Love is bigger than us. And yet, in my mind, the fact that he is looking for her and finds her and wakes her up shows us that there's been a transformation going on his side too. That as she's been making her journey, he's been healing and also then coming for her. Does this make sense? So it's not so much that he rescues her, but that what she put in motion finds its fulfillment through him coming then and playing a similar role for her. So there's this beautiful mutuality.
Mm.
And what she's in contact with is an underworld eternal energy. But of course, that would be too big for a mortal, but he's not. So it's like they each act within the appropriate realm of action too, if that makes sense. She does it on the material plane with a lamp. He can come in and wake her up from an underworld death. But in both instances, it's this sleeping, waking each other up from a sleep.
That's very interesting. And it lands so much. I love the counterpart of the image. That for me is very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I actually, and I think I mentioned that to you, I don't love Eros in the tale. I feel as a Greek, he has that primordial force. He is so powerful. He removes our limbs in many ways with that power of desire and all. But then in the story, here in a Greek context, he is so much of a baby boy. He feels very handsome and everything and alluring in that way, beautiful. But where is his potency? Where is that vitality? Where is that complexity even in him to make him so interesting? Because Psyche and Aphrodite, incredibly interesting, going through incredible emotions. Where do you stand with Eros? And I would love for you to change my mind about him. I would love to love him in the tale.
It's not his story. I think that he is a catalyst and then ultimately he's the prize. I guess I don't know. I don't know if I have anything that I can say that would convince you beyond what I said about the sleep and him coming and rescuing her. But I think that the story is so much about Psyche and her initiation via the goddess Aphrodite that he's almost, you don't really want to call the primal deity of love a tangent, but he's the backdrop.
Yeah.
So I see this story as being about soul, which is something that we have as humans engaged with these eternal psychic experiences, feelings, concepts, and that that the soul is longing for that and goes through a process for that. To me, that's the central story. And so then that Eros is,
That's actually quite illuminating for me. There were some things you said right now that really hit a note for me, which is it's not his story. To accept this, I think maybe because of the beautiful sculptures and paintings, and then the fact that the story carries his name. But I was actually recording with Lisa Marciano, and we mentioned the story. And I even said, it shouldn't be called that. It should be called Psyche and Aphrodite. Like, it shouldn't be called Psyche and Eros, because he plays a secondary role there. Yet, you said so beautifully, he's catalyst and then he's prize. I love that. And it actually makes it a very woman story, because in so many of the men's story, we are catalyst and we are prize. And that really bothers me. So let's have a story where they are catalyst and they are prize.
That's right. That's right. That is exactly right. Yes.
Talking a little bit about Aphrodite. So she is jealous. She is proud. It feels like she's definitely testing Psyche harshly. It's almost like she's preparing Psyche as well to be worthy of marrying her son. And jealousy is also a theme in this tale between Aphrodite and Psyche, but then also between the sisters in the beginning. And I was just wondering your thoughts on jealousy between women, especially when it appears in this mythical context. And how can we work with this energy in ourselves?
So I have a certain perspective on Aphrodite's jealousy because I see her as an initiator. And of course, this is only one way to read the story. I'm not saying that this is it, but I see her jealousy as coming from a sense of the value of what she is. And Aphrodite is beauty and love and sensuality and relatedness in the particular, right? For one other, for an other, not this sort of fake thing. And jealous, yes, but because she values what she is, then the question becomes, if others are going to see that in this human, is this person worthy of this? Am I being degraded because people don't understand? So they're willing to take this like one-off. They're trying to they're willing to buy the knockoff rather than get the real. So when I think about it that way, then it feels to me like there's an overall elevation of the characteristics that the goddess and this human woman share. And that's why then it leads me to this path, this notion of what Aphrodite is doing is a kind of initiating and like testing and refining. And then we see what happens at the end is that Psyche is elevated. She does become goddess. So in that case, in that instance, in terms of how we operate as women, yes, there's a jealousy there maybe, but that's almost like a tough love kind of mentorship. But then the jealousy comes into the story in another place because that's what motivates those sisters to say, Psyche, tell us about your husband. Oh, are you sure he's not a monster? And that is interesting because what does Psyche do? She realizes, oh, I actually do have some doubts of my own, but then she takes their advice and it turns out to be this really great thing to do. It becomes a growth opportunity for her because she connects with it where there's truth. So I think that tells us something when we're on the receiving end. It's like, is there any truth to this? What I'm getting, and then can I make that useful to me rather than being brought down by it? And then as far as the sisters themselves, I think that women often do things to bring each other down from a kind of internalized misogyny. And that's something that hopefully we're chipping away at, right?
Mm.
As we all wake up to the ways that we've been influenced by the culture that we're in and embrace the possibilities that are emerging being alive at this time and in a contemporary sisterhood.
Catherine, you touched on so much. Like, I think we could be having this conversation for hours because there is the initiator, there is the jealousy. It is so paradoxical in many ways. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time. We're coming to an end. But you did mention initiations, and both of us believe that myth can help us navigate the complexities of modern life. And I wonder, in your view, what are some of the contemporary initiations we as women are going through collectively that you feel myth can help us hold, understand, cross through?
I think I'm picking up a thread of a theme that I've introduced early on in this conversation. Maybe the most important is helping us reconnect with a greater reality, like to understand that we're in a story. So what's happening, what we do as individuals, what we're doing as a species, it's all matters. It's important. I'm not saying that that our actions and what's in the news, whatever, isn't real. At the same time, we are in a process and there's more going on. And there's more going on in us than what we are brought up to understand. And if we tap into that, there are processes and helpers and resources that are available to us. There's a greater wisdom in a lot of the myths, even in the Christian myth of creation. We are the last ones to get here. We are the younger brothers. We are the ones who know the least. And see, I find that very encouraging as we move further into the stories and as science starts to ask different questions. And we start to be learning more from a variety of paradigms about what we're in. So I think that's that's probably the biggest, is that we're not alone and we're not limited to what we do and know and understand as humans.
Thank you for naming that. It's so true. And inviting that ecological consciousness, understanding the peril times we're in. Because we're getting to the end, I wonder if there's one thing that you would like to add for our listeners to carry from this conversation.
If you're like me, you're experiencing just a real overload in terms of information and events and distractions and calls for attention. And it's really easy to spend all of your time at that level on Instagram, reading the news, having conversations with people, and dealing with the mechanics of life. You are always being called by what we'll call the inner life. Always. There is always something percolating, always something that wants your attention. And it's worth it. It's worth it to pay attention to those things, the things that rise up and catch your attention, and to see where they take you. It's so easy to imagine that we don't have time or that they're a tangent or that it's not going to go anywhere. But oftentimes the solutions or the medicine that we need, that's where it is. That's where it is. It's in that conversation. And that's what our myths tell us.
Thank you. This was so beautiful and a full body yes right now. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom in such a generous way. This was filled with insights, filled with richness, really illuminating. And for those who are new to your work, what's the best way to connect with you and where they might begin the journey with your work?
So my website is Mythic Mojo, MOJO.com. And There's information there about the various things that I do. There's also information about my podcast, Myth Matters. So going to the website gives you an idea of a range of things. And the podcast, Myth Matters, is available on most platforms. So anyone can also go and look for that, especially if they are podcast listeners. This has been so delightful, Maria. Thank you so much. And for orchestrating such an engaging and interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. I'll make sure all these links are on the show notes. I love your podcast and I would highly recommend it to our listeners. And it's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Until next time, right?
Until next time. And to our dear myth lovers, see you in our next episode. Until then, remember, your life is a story only you can tell. Stay close to what feels true and sovereign within you.